Nick is fallen gentleman. He sat down.
This is ours.
I'm just going to keep scooting over till Good evening. I'm just kidding. I'm Derek Bermel.
That was last week.
I tried doing something Halloween-y. Put my bottle of water down. Thank you. I'm the artist in residence, believe it or not, of the Institute for Advanced Study. Advanced Study. It's hard to say. Do any of you listen to these shows on the radio where we broadcast? I'm just curious. Yes. Oh, wow. Okay. I have problems on that show saying advanced study. I had to practice that quite a bit. Advanced study. There's a lot of diphthongs.
It's like saying guests with vests.
Thank you. This is Fred Cherry, by the way, everybody. Paul Neubauer flanking him on the other side. Here we have three members of the esteemed Borromeo Quartet who are going to be playing today. Nicholas Kitchen, Christopher Tong, and Mai Motobuchi. And here we have the composer of one of the pieces, Andrea Pinto Correa. And so I should say that better. Andrea Pinto Correa. Andrea Pinto Correa. I'm getting better. Thank you. In my true Portuguese accent. This is really thrilling to have all these people here for this pre-concert talk, and people will be drifting in. Just ignore them, or say hi if you know them, maybe. We're just going to talk a little bit about this very rich program we have here tonight, which involves, I suppose, Bartók being the great granddaddy of the concert, who appears first. The first thing we hear is the last Bartók quartet, and then we're going to hear this world premiere by Andrea. I'm sorry. There's a slight change in program. There's a reverse in the second and third pieces. We just figured every good program should have a slight switch. So this one does. And the second piece you're going to hear is a piece by Milton Babbitt, a Princeton composer, in fact, lives here in town.
But he's also a world composer in another respect.
And Fred's going to tell you about that when we talk about it, right? Yeah, I mean, Fred is actually one we have the great interpreters of Milton Babbitt's music here with us tonight, so that's pretty exciting. And then we have the world premiere by Andrea Pinto Correa. It's a clarinet quintet, which is on popular themes, folk themes of Portugal. And then we have one of my pieces. How did that get on there? Oh, Soul Garden. Paul Neubauer as soloist, Fred Cherry as semi-soloist, guest artist, and the Borromeo String Quartet. So using all these folks except us two. Then you get a chance to breathe and walk outside for a few minutes. And then you're going to hear Fred and I play a duo, which I wrote for Fred and me. No, you're going to hear Fred and me play a duo that I wrote for Fred and me, not Fred and I. My mother would have been very upset about that. She's a big stickler for me and I. And then last, we're going to hear a quite epic piece by the Argentinian-born composer Osvaldo Galekhov called The Dreams and Prayers of Isaac the Blind, which, as I noted and will renote, was written the same year as this very hall here was built. As a lecture hall, in fact, but also a place where music could be performed, and I think it sounds pretty good for music, so we're very lucky. So just to get started, I mean, one of the things that I'm very excited about for my own pieces is that they're being performed here by the people who recorded them, which is always a nice thing, and the people for whom I wrote them. I mean, I wrote Soul Garden for Paul with the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and I wrote this piece for Fred, which was premiered on a recital of his at Merkin Hall, and we're going to hear another world premiere tonight. And I don't know. I wanted to just start off by talking about there is a kind of a folk music theme that runs through this concert, and certain pieces which you might not think of as coming out of folk music, may have something to do with folk music.
I wanted to add something about that because I heard Andrea's piece for the first time last night, and I did understand the folk part of it, but it's based on folk music, not is folk music. Exactly. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. As I described in the program notes, I was very influenced in my upbringing with my father's research, and I was exposed a lot to folk music. So this is my interpretation of folk. Those are not really songs, these are motifs, a sort of gathering of gestures and textures that through the years, I kind of melt in my mind and my heart, and this is the way I try to have that spirit of folk, but it's kind of my folk, not really.
Yes. I felt that when I heard it, and I also feel the same way about the Bartok, but I'm not sure how the Borromeos feel about that piece.
Well, Bartok's certainly a composer. I mean, you can speak a lot about Bartok because you've played his Viola Concerto as well, and you've played the Borromeo. By the way, has been doing. I mean, in the past couple of seasons, has done all the Bartok quartets, and you've done concerts where you do all of them, right? Those are pretty long concerts, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we've done a very beautiful concert that we've done quite a bit. Is doing all 6 of them. And going straight through one, we do 2 of them and then an intermission and then 2 of them again and then an intermission and then the last 2. And it is kind of awesome because each one of the pieces can be quite amazing on its own. But when you see almost the rebuilding of a person between one and the next, it's just stunning. You realize that it's similar to what we're so used to thinking of happening with Beethoven, but in fact you see that someone like Bartok went through the same total transformation, and all of them are great.
Do you think it peaks in modernity with number 4?
Well, I'm not.
That's something I thought, but I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Would say something interesting. We had the concert last night. And I'm looking forward to reading Milton Babbitt's essay about number 4. And number 4 is definitely a piece where virtually anything you can think of with which to analyze that piece, it comes up in spades. Now, a really funny thing that happened when I was looking at I had a great chance to visit the Bartok archive in Budapest and look at all the manuscripts of the quartets. And it was very exciting on many levels, but one of them is, the second quartet starts with the beautiful da-da-dee-da-ya-da. That's the opening motif in the first violin. And in the last movement, it starts with these quiet chords, and all of a sudden it goes da-da-dee-no. Well, Laszlo Schomfei told me an interesting story. He said, someone pointed that out to Bartok at a lecture, actually, that I think he gave at Harvard. And he said, oh my, that's wonderful. He had no idea. But he wasn't at all surprised. It was because what I think is so interesting, what I've come to feel in his case is that his forms tend to agree with many, many proportions and mathematical principles, but I don't think he's doing it on purpose. He's actually feeling his way through how these things fit together, and his ear, the more time at least we and I spend with him, you realize that his ear was so precise that he could really choose the way the chords fit together in a way that was really exquisitely detailed. And I think that taste always led him to things that were symmetrical and ordered. And then you can go backwards from that and analyze it, and it comes out as if he came to it with a mathematical formula, which I don't think he did, actually.
I've heard it leveled as a criticism against Bartok. They said if it went up, it went down, like the Concerto for Orchestra. Yeah, he was unable to get away from that, although you could say that his strength is his weakness, or the opposite. Perhaps.
Well, another interesting thing that I found in those manuscripts of the Bartok quartets, one of which is still there and one of which has been omitted. at the exact middle of quartet number 1 and the exact middle of quartet number 2. If you look at the exact middle of quartet number 2 right now, you'll see very high in the first violin part, bum, 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 B-A-C-H. Now, I didn't notice it for a while until in the manuscript that you see in Budapest, when you watch Bartók's hand, that moment comes, and the second movement continues, and what we know as switching to a triple meter, it's not there.
That part is not in?
No, not just that part. The whole second half of the movement does not change to triple meter. It stays in even numbered meters. It stays the same. It doesn't switch. However, the switching point is where it says B-A-C-H, which is the exact middle of the work. Now,
by the way, he's not the only one to use that trick, because Arnold Schoenberg does it in the Variations for Orchestra.
I knew you were going to take this to Schoenberg, and we're getting away from Bartók.
fantastic.
Wait,
Well,
okay.
let me just finish the story quickly. I know I don't mean to talk too much, but the amazing thing is that at the exact point of number 1, middle of the second movement, well, exactly, high in the first violin part, B-A-C-H, but, and this probably bears the advice of Kodai, because there are a lot of markings from Kodai there, and at least Schoenfei's hypothesis is that Kodai looked at that and said, Bela, that's too obvious. And in fact, what happened is it's gone, and a new section is in its place, which is the one we know.
Now, I mean, so you've been talking about the fourth quartet is just this kind of epic. Say something also about. I mean, I'm curious about these guys. Also, what your take is about on this quartet.
Yeah, just answering Fred's question from before. I always kind of felt like the fifth quartet was the farthest out there, just because speaking to the symmetrical structures of the just not just the plan of the movements, but within the movements how the motives are arranged, organized. That fifth quartet is as far as one can go in towards of a sort of perfect symmetry, more so than number 4. Although the fourth quartet I think is harder for audiences to get in to understand, maybe. So yeah, it's a little more jagged, I guess, in the sonorities.
I also didn't mean to say that I think he loved the symmetries of them. I just think he didn't approach them with in fact, he made a point of saying very strongly, I don't believe one should have a preconceived idea. It has to evolve in an organic way. And I think, of course, he was amazing at doing that.
There's supposedly a lot of golden mean stuff. Bartók, people talk about it.
Well, and again, people, I think a lot of times, I'm guessing, even when one person draws, you might choose a point for that line. It may very well be that place you chose is the golden mean.
And he also wrote, there were also places where he wrote in the minute markings of what the timings were supposed to be, so you could tell you were 4 minutes and 12 seconds into the movement by his own calculations. And those are things that I don't know of another composer that's done that.
Yeah, 7 minutes and 21 seconds and a half for the first movement of.
And I mean, I kind of agree. Well, on both sides, I think a lot of what Bartók did was intuitive, but I think that he, through his intuitive work on his pieces and the kind of finding the sonorities, I think he came up with a pretty good analyses of his own work and was able to actually kind of codify a lot of his the structures that were going on inside his mind. So he was able to actually, which I think any good composer should be able to do, which is kind of figure out what are the things I like, what am I actually doing here, and that's something that certainly Gershwin was seeking, which he found when he went over to Europe finally to study with Schillinger. I mean, the main thing that Schillinger didn't really change the way Gershwin composed, but he gave Gershwin a language for which to talk about what he composed. How does it feel playing viola in Bartók?
I feel like that man really knew what he was doing with the instruments. Oftentimes, when you meet some composers, that it feels like, oh my gosh, he must have played the violin or cello, but not the viola kind of writing. But the Bartók just really suits in the hands. And for the Bartok 6 today, as Nick sort of mentioned when we were doing our 6, and when we get to the 6th quartet after going through his life, it's a very different meaning to play and perform than just to play the 6. But as a player, of course, we have to sort of recreate the feeling that you get to at the end and of his life and perform. Like tonight's program is at the very beginning of the program, so we have to sort of recreate that.
Yeah, like I said, in a way, he's kind of the granddaddy of this concert. And then also, at the end of his life, is the Viola Concerto.
The Viola Concerto, I just want to mention as far as what Bartok, with the timings, in the Viola Concerto, which he died as he was writing the piece, so it's only the first sketch is done of the Viola Concerto. He'd gone back to the first page and done more work on it, but there are sections that are empty and blank in that piece, yet there's still the timings. So he knew exactly what was going to happen in those places, but unfortunately we don't. So, we can sort of guess from what is there, but there are two places in particular there. What was he going to do? But he obviously had a very clear idea. Otherwise, how could he know exactly 16 minutes and 30, whatever it was, to write down those timings? He was very much like this, going through the piece and saying, and there it is. And I know he had two children, Bela Jr. and Peter Bartok, and I know Peter Bartok's living in Florida at the Bartok Archives in Homosassa, Florida. And there they also have many manuscripts, and they're going through a lot of these manuscripts and fixing a lot of the mistakes, because a lot of these composers, depending on how careful they are, and the publishers, there can always be mistakes or changes, and how did this happen? And for instance, they did the solo violin sonata, and it's very different than the published version, the original published version, like with the quarter tones and all that stuff. And it's because, sometimes, like in that case, Bartok was influenced by Menuhin, who said, oh, well, do it this way, but actually Bartok meant something else. So it's always fascinating to see these manuscripts, and that's what they're doing. For instance, in Florida, they're going back, and in the Viola Concerto case, it was actually finished when he died by T.W. Surly, and Surly changed it so dramatically that you could call it the Bartok Surly Concerto. Now this new version, not so new anymore, goes back to what Bartok wrote and sounds much more like Bartok.
So, we could probably talk about Bartok all night, because there's plenty to talk about. But, I'm just thinking, going ahead to having this new piece written for you by Bermel. What was that like? Pretend I'm not here, or but talk about the process a little bit.
Well,
as a player, because you talked about Menuhin
right.
influencing Bartok,
Right.
because he's writing for him.
Well, I do recall working with the composer on the piece, actually, and there was this commission came up, and it came to be Mr. Bermel, and we had gone through, my likes and his likes, and he'd say, well, what do you like? And I say, oh, I like gypsy music and all this stuff. But it turned into this soul garden stuff. And what I remember in particular is working on the opening of this piece. I don't want to give it away too much, but when I talked to him, it was very clear. You do like these quarter tones, and it's very sort of, well, what exactly does it mean? And he'd go, no, you just do this. Something like. As a matter of fact, you might be able to do that tune for us, because I think you're acquainted with Mr. Bermel. Can you just sing that, because I think you sing it better than I do.
His spirit.
Just try to.
Well, it was something. And I remember talking through this stuff with you, and then you saying, and then saying, so I wrote it out like this. No, you wouldn't write that like you would bow this like this. If I bow it like this, it's going to sound like this. And it's that real process. Where a player is really involved.
But actually, when you have something like that, it's like, well, how exactly are you going to notate that? And I was very lucky because I got to work with the composer, but if someone else isn't working with Derek, then how are they going to know it except from our recording, I guess? But still, you know, the notation of the they're different kinds of inflections that he just sang. So sometimes, as we may say, sly go, or, you know, those kinds of little subtle things. He was very clear when we worked on it. No, do it this way. No, this is what, no. What? Oh, yeah, So, but in any case, it's been great. It's always great fun to play this piece, and it starts out in this sort of very simple way, and then gets extremely wild, and there are these moans, and there's everything is in there, and it's quite a vehicle for the viola because it's you don't expect, you know, it starts out very gently, and then
It kind of goes crazy in the middle.
Crazy,
But, you know,
yeah.
we as performers are, in a sense, translating the music from the page for you. And people translate in different ways, and some people are very attached to the page, and other people put themselves into the picture. And sometimes it's been said that some performers put themselves too much in the picture. But also, if the composer's good and Derek is good, the notation should carry it up to a certain point where there are enough specifics in there that you can find the way that suits you and the music. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, and I think that what Paul was talking about, I mean, for me, I took advantage of working with a great performer who had that kind of nuance, and also in the case with Fred, I mean, where they could say, well, actually, I wouldn't write, that's too much information. No, that's too little information. No, that's wrong. You know, oh, that's right. Do it like this. I like this notation better. And then putting that into the score for future players, because you may or may not know, I mean, well, you know other people have played it, but probably about 9 or 10 other people have played the solo part. So they're able somehow from that, and probably getting the recording too, to kind of piece together, you know, exactly how it should go. And that's also a tribute to you, you know, as a performer, because you were that exacting. I mean, Paul gave me very specific notes, and as did Fred.
On a slight tangent off of this subject, when we talk about the early music performance practice people who say that they're reinstating the way it was heard in Bach's time or Mozart's time and Beethoven's time, I was going, oh, really?
Okay, well, but I wanted to also talk about Gallihoff, because the Gallihoff piece is also is a different kind of take on folk material. But again, the clarinet part is quite bare in that piece. There's not a lot of information, and so you have to come to it with a knowledge of the style. If you don't, it's gonna sound pretty crappy.
Did you listen
I would say.
What's his name? Feidman?
Gyura Feidman.
Did you listen to Feidman?
Well, I'll tell you something. Gyura Feidman, for whom it was written for the Cleveland Quartet, and Gyura Feidman, who is a klezmer, an Israeli player, and I played a piece that was written for Feidman by my teacher, my Israeli teacher, Andrei Haidu, who actually also wrote him a klezmer concerto where he used all of his clarinets. I have to use 4 clarinets in this piece, actually 5, but I cheated and I'm using 4. You're supposed to also use a basset horn, which I could not find. I think on eBay maybe, but other than that, they're pretty rare. Maybe David Schifrin probably has one. But I would say that Feidman, I have heard him play, and he's a very particular kind of player. He does certain things that a lot of klezmer players don't do. Mostly I just sat around and listened to players like Dave Tarras and Naftali Brandwine and the great kind of older klezmer players, a lot of American players who came from Europe who are recorded.
I think of Feidman as being kind of a gentle player overall.
Yeah.
And not like a shrieking klezmer player that you sort of picture with the clarinet in the air and going crazy. He's very refined.
And for the Borromeo, I mean, they've played this before too with other clarinet players, and I'm just kind of curious, what's it like to play the string parts, which are also quite, which are quite in a way more detailed than the clarinet part, which leaves out a lot of the inflections.
Well, I've only played it twice, but well,
Twice as many as I have.
There was a question last night about the difference of do we get a different response from an audience if the audience is familiar with the folk material at hand? And I didn't answer it very clearly last night, but I thought about the question, and it occurred to me, I'm an Asian American guy playing mostly Western art music from a time before I was alive, and my parents were immigrants from, the Orient, whatever you want to call it, and I'm playing in this quintet, vaguely, klezmer sounding, written by an Argentinian Jew, right? And you have this strange convoluted thing. I don't know. Maybe it's some people might have a background which may be conducive to one style or another, but I find that for most of what we're asked to do, we're asked to find what we connect to in the music. What we see, what we feel. I didn't grow up Jewish. I didn't grow up with this music around me, but when I see the notes, a lot of the job is to go from what seems very foreign at first and try to connect to a sound which I don't know if it's authentic, but it's sincere. Yeah.
Thank you. Fred, how is Milton Babbitt a world composer, and how is he a composer of his own kind of folk music?
Well, I said he was a world composer, meaning that he's known throughout the world. That's in the way in which, and people have heard his music everywhere. And when he kind of burst on the scene in 1948 with new theories about how music could be constructed, everybody paid attention. He was famous, and he was also infamous. And people said, one more time, here comes the death of music at the hands of some other maniac. First it was Bach, and then it was Mozart, and then it was Beethoven, and and it was Wagner, and then it was Schoenberg, and then it was Babbitt, and a lot of other people have been. Maybe, I don't know. Before Bach, were there any? Maybe not, or there may have been. Machaut, was he? No, I thought he was celebrated.
Yeah, he was celebrated.
Machaut was a diplomat. He was a poet. He was a composer. He was one of the greatest composers of the last 1,000 years. We all seem to agree on that. We talked about.
We didn't all agree on that.
No, but
we agreed on Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven,
yes.
and then Stravinsky. Was he on everybody's list?
A lot of us agreed that Machaut. Three of us.
No,
agreed.
Stravinsky was not. No. Right, because of Chrysler. Right. Okay. We did our 10 greats.
We had three. We had three though.
Okay, but let's get back to the matter at hand. Milton Babbitt.
Why?
Because there are three great Bs on this concert. Of course, there's Bartok, Babbitt. Oh no, there's
Bermel.
Oh yeah, that was the other one.
What kind of name is that, Bermel?
Those are the
anyway?
three Bs of.
So back onto the subject of Babbitt, that he burst on the scene with these new ways of writing music, and it was based on the idea of combinatoriality, which everybody in this room knows far better than I do what it really means. But it's a way of deriving sets from sets and inferring ideas from other ideas of number theory. But I once asked him how he did that first piece, the first 1948, the composition for 4 instruments, and he said he actually got the idea from Alban Berg. So this is based on a traditional way of writing music. By that time was already traditional. And then he broke out into his own forms. And you could also trace in the 6 Babbitt quartets the same. The life of a composer is in those 6 quartets. And they go from being simple to being very complex in the middle, and then a little bit less so at the end. And also Milton came from Mississippi, where he was an exiled Jew. No, he wasn't really an exile. He was from there. But I think he must have felt pretty funny in 1926 in Jackson, Mississippi. Wound up in the North with the Yankees, and not the New York Yankees, but he is a big baseball fan, by the way. And his music is informed by lots of other kinds of music. Now, maybe you'll hear it, maybe you won't, but I can only tell you one anecdote about the piece I'm going to play tonight, because I was at Paul's Festival in Oklahoma, and we do half-hour concerts for contemporary music at noon, or is it 11? 11, pardon me. And the Babbitt was the 3rd piece on the program, and someone came up to me after the program and said, that in that 3rd piece, I thought you were talking to me. And I'm thinking, 3rd piece, you don't mean the Babbitt, do you? She said, yes, the Babbitt. And it is very conversational, or I should say it's more like a monologue, but it portrays many characters and does many, many things, and the choice of notes, to my ear, is perfect.
I'm curious, just since on this topic of being a world composer. I mean, for you two who are not American, maybe you are American now. No, okay. So from different perspectives, European or Portuguese, Iberian,
Well, Andrea is really a composer who's,
yeah, Andrea.
you're in exile here. Do you
I
feel
am
like an
in
exile?
I do feel like an exile.
Yeah.
Yes,
So you're
it's
not in
true.
your real home territory.
No, not at all. It's very different, I have to say. But I'm trying
Oh.
to figure out what was your question.
No, I didn't get to it yet. But but I'm curious. Just how do you? I mean, okay, you're a jazz. You've had experience with jazz in the past. As I'm revealing this stuff when I may not. Maybe I shouldn't. But you've been also played the saxophone, all kinds of things. I mean, what's the kind of experience meeting? I mean, there are so many things that kind of come together here in this. You come to America and you're studying composition with a jazz background, seeing Americans also influenced by Europeans, and in all that, how do you kind of find your way forward as a composer? Being interested in folk music from Portugal and
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at these different factors, the interesting thing is they are contradictory, most of them in my life, and I think that's what makes it interesting, actually. Yes, my background, I started with the folk traditions because of my father and my family, and I was drawn to Coltrane when I was 10, but I didn't start music until I was 18, actually. And I started playing saxophone, and I came to United States because of that, because I was a saxophone player. But unfortunately, as soon as I got here, I had this major accident. So that was the end of my career as a saxophone player. It was very brief. I went home, and I spent many years without studying music. And later, I still wanted to have some relationship with music, and I could not play an instrument. So I started writing for jazz orchestra. It was a couple of years ago. It was not so long ago. So that's how I started composition, and my jazz orchestra pieces were very dense and orchestral, and they were getting bigger and bigger and bigger with no solos. So it was kind of a natural way. It was not that I was sitting at home, I'm going to become a composer. Actually, I got to composition, the concert composition, as it's called here, 3.5 years ago. And it was, I had to go through many experiences until I got to the point where I am, which is, it made me kind of a late bloomer, but at the same time, a person that probably has more experience than the average classical composer in institution in academia, which I think is a good thing. I also think it completes me, I think, as a musician, the fact I have so many contradictory,
Did the jazz players that you wrote for say, this isn't really jazz?
Yeah, I unfortunately I started when I started composing for jazz. I had a teacher, which is Bob Brookmeyer, which is very famous here in America. He's most well known for being the teacher of Maria Schneider, and he's an incredible composer. Not only wrote for jazz orchestra, but he wrote also for orchestra, string quartets, and so on. So he was a very open-minded man, and I had this conflict with the soloists who say, "Well, why do you write everything and you have all these articulations, you have all these dynamics, we just want to solo, just give us the head and we just want to play." And my music was not at all like that, and I never even wrote a straight swing piece. Everything was very like orchestral. And Bob will say, just take it easy, you just do whatever you feel like doing, and that's the way your voice is, so just keep developing. And eventually got to a moment that I figured out he was right, and that moment was when I decided, okay, my music is going to orchestral, and that's what I should be doing. So I made a transition in a very natural way. Actually, it was very natural.
wow. And Maya, I wanted to ask about your experience just coming to the States, and obviously playing with a group here. Oh, many microphones being offered to you. I mean, just what resonated most when you came over?
I actually felt, well, I after living here for now longer than I was in Japan. Now I just actually this month I hit the middle point where I came over here and it's equals, and now day by day it's getting longer to be in this country. I've seen the histories, and I've seen this people's reactions, and sometimes I feel of American people feeling a little bit shame of themselves in the world, and coming from other side of the world, coming to this country, I actually feel like there are so many positive things that we should be all proud of being in this country, especially having such a big heart to accept all these people. And when I came to this country, basically my parents had no money to send me, and I had to always seek for scholarships. And in Japan, back home, it's unheard of to be able to give a scholarship to a foreign student. It's always available to their own people, but not others. And when I came here, they were just so generous of offering the scholarships, offering the ways to living, so that I could study. And that big heart only exists in this country.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
I just want to add something, which is, unfortunately, I come from a country that even scholarships are not available for natives. So, putting this in perspective, it was kind of a similar experience. I made all through the American system by scholarships from America. And what I find really interesting is, for me to write a music that expresses Portuguese culture, I have to be in America. Because at this moment in Europe, unfortunately, composers that won't express their nationality usually, especially from small countries, are repressed at this moment for some reason. So in that way, I'm exiled because, unfortunately, the academic system, for instance, in Portugal, is very, very harsh and very moved towards France or England, and if you don't write in a certain style, your chances of actually being accepted are very slim. So I have to say that only being in America, I could express myself the way that I want to express myself, which is my background, which is a very sad thing. So in a way, the same way that May, she was talking about America, I feel very fortunate to be here because this is where I'm able to express myself without being repressed in a way. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I mean, that's an interesting place to kind of open things up for questions, because, especially because we kind of come full circle back to Bartók, who came here, of course, being exiled and died here, as Paul mentioned, in the middle of writing the Viola Concerto. Maybe that's a warning for composers who write viola concertos. I could say the same thing about the clarinet, though, because lots of people write for the clarinet and then they kick it. So, Brahms, Mozart, Schumann, Schubert. That's Shepherd on the Rock is one of the last pieces. Yeah, he wrote for clarinet. He wrote 800 pieces, writes for clarinet. Mozart Concerto, one of the last works. Brahms, of course, at the end of his life, he went back and then said, hey, you know what? I love this wonderful clarinet player. Let's write for the clarinet. Beethoven? No. In any case, there's other examples too. But anyway, Bartók. So we come back full circle to this composer in exile, Bartók. And in fact, I suppose every composer here, in a way, is in exile on this program. You have Bartók, who came here at the end of his life, and Andrea. Milton Babbitt, as you mentioned, the exile in Mississippi, Jewish exile in Mississippi. Osvaldo Golikov came here from Argentina, and me, of course, exile from New York here in New Jersey. So, questions for these folks?
Perhaps comments.
Comments.
That we didn't touch on that you want to talk about. And things you want to talk about that we didn't talk about, like recipes for
disaster?
No, for delicious food.
Food. How is the intermission structured? Well, there's two bathrooms, one on either side, and there's another. Actually, this is a very good question, because there is limited bathroom space. So there is a bathroom in the other building.
I had a friend who once said the intermission is the time when you talk about us and we talk about you.
Right. Very nice.
Also true.
Other questions?
Comments. I want to know what people are thinking about. Yes.
I heard the Babbitt last night, and is it different, really different every time? And it's, I know that it's not random, but it's not sort of random.
Question was, okay.
And is it the same every time you play?
Well,
The question was whether the Babbitt, that he heard the Babbitt last night, is it the same every time it's played?
it's not, because first of all, it's a pretty new piece, and so this is not a piece that I've known since I was a young boy, like a Beethoven sonata or even a Bartok quartet, which I knew when I was like 9 years old. So I'm still finding different pathways through it, and presumably all good music has many, many pathways through it. And the Babbitt is interesting because it has many shocking changes of dynamics and lots of disjointed melodic contours. So it is kind of different because the time opens up a little bit.
I know Carter, and what you were saying about Bartok, the timings and being very specific. Carter's very, very specific about, measuring numbers and, all that sort of thing. How is Milton about that?
He just asked about it's just hard to hear in the back. He asked about the specificity of notation in Babbitt as opposed to other composers like Elliott Carter. And
There was a time when Milton used a time point set, which meant that he measured intervals and measured time in much the same way, so that the distance between notes was determined by the pitch of the note and the disposition of the note. So yes, it's very specific, but it's very different in Carter, who's actually both Milton Babbitt and Elliott Carter I consider to be my musical fathers, because I played their music when I was still a teenager. And I've known them ever since, and still play them and still talk to them. So,
and they may outlast you.
What?
And they may outlast you. You never know.
At this rate, they're going to. Yeah. They write in a very different way. And Carter often says, in kind of angry way, "I'm not a 12-note composer." And then somebody said, "Well, what about that piece with the 12-note chord?" And he said, "I needed that chord." So, yeah, but also that he does things in a very different way, because his, in the old days, was a grid, and he would work out, for example, in the double concerto for harpsichord, piano, and two orchestras, it was a grid of 49 against 50. And what he did was he just, had a big piece of graph paper and worked out the polyrhythm. Then the composing comes in. This is not deterministic composing, in which you can only do it one way. You've got the grid, and then you decide which thread am I going to pull at what time, and what am I going to do with it. So you have to remember that all composers, and I should say including Bach especially, does this thing. And you were talking about Bartok with the timings. I have the copy of the manuscript of the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto by Bach, and you know that he wrote out all the bar lines before he wrote a note on the page, because in the very first bar he ran out of space. It was one of those things, plan ahead, funny things where the ahead gets smaller and smaller, because he actually had to move into the next bar. So many composers know exactly what it's going to be like, but then there's a creative process.
Yeah. I think Bach, what's interesting to me about Bach in this regard is that from sketches, you can see that what he spent the most time on was getting the right theme that he could then play around with in the way that he wanted to. And this may be also true with Bartok, I don't know, but he knew, maybe somewhat intuitively, but also perhaps in a way mathematically, he knew this isn't going to lead me, so I think what he worked tremendously on was getting a theme with the right intervals and combinations of notes in the right order and length.
Yeah, but I wanted to add this thing about Bach, is that every time he rewrote a piece, he rewrote it. So in the cantata number 168, I think, it has an organ solo, and the solo starts up a perfect fourth. And then he rewrote that piece as a piano concerto, and oddly enough, instead of going up from G to C, he goes down from B to E. So he could never leave anything alone in that respect. The details were always changeable according to his artistic ideals.
So are other questions?
Sorry, that was...
okay. She said that. Well, she gave a quote from. Okay, I didn't say Schoenberg. I said Schillinger. I probably swallowed my words, which I should not do. But yes, that is true. That Gershwin, George Gershwin. This is just maybe an aside, but perhaps not, because I suppose my music has something to do with his. He was on my list. He was on my. Well, we weren't sure about that, but yeah, he was getting there. Anyway, because I backtracked. But this is our list of the 10 great composers of the past 1,000 years we were discussing yesterday. Gershwin went to Europe he was very, very insecure about the idea of him being a concert music composer because he came out of Tin Pan Alley. And throughout his life, he kept saying, I want to go to study with somebody. Of course, his reputation was already cemented by the time he was in his mid-20s. So when he went over to Europe for various things, he went to see Ravel. And Ravel said, no. I can't possibly teach you. Perhaps this also happened with Schoenberg. I don't know. I know that it definitely happened with Ravel. And Ravel said, I would ruin you. And so Gershwin eventually did find somebody willing to teach him, who was mostly a theorist named Schillinger. And he went over, studied with Schillinger dutifully, and came back to the U.S. and kept writing exactly the same kind of music. I'm sure some people would say it was slightly different. He wrote Porgy and Bess, but at the time that he was working, after he came back, of course, Schillinger made a big deal about how he had taught Gershwin, and he basically earned his fame through that, worldwide fame anyway. He was known already in Europe, but he was, but Gershwin was very happy to now have all these labels with which to label the things that he was doing. He felt that he had an understanding now of what he was already doing as a composer, what to label the chords, what to call everything, which he felt that before he just did it intuitively. Now he saw that there was a language in which he was working, which might address some of the stuff we were talking about with regards to Bartók. Also. So, yes, sir. This is for me, right? Oh, okay. Want to talk about that, Paul?
Well, if you have, da 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 or da 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 da, you have many more options to write with when you're using the quarter tones or even semitones, and you don't agree with that?
Can I add one thing into that?
Okay.
Because it's not like he's using a 24-note scale. It's not, he's not dividing up every semitone in half and using a 24-tone scale, if that's what you meant.
What I used them as was more like inflection.
Yeah, it's an inflection thing. I mean, I have played pieces. There's Ligeti wrote a solo viola sonata where he says, go up 1/3 of a tone, go up 1/5 of a tone, go up 1/5. I mean, so slight that you can't even hear it, basically, but just the slightest things, but so exact. But that's a totally different way of writing. And this,
so why is Bermel better than Ligeti?
Because it's from the heart.
Oh, it's from the heart.
It's not from no. But in any case, as you'll see, it really is a soul garden. It's about the soul, and so it's and this, you're not going to write da 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 da. You're not going to be like that. You can't. Otherwise, you're not going to get the soul.
So, I don't know that much about it, but I've studied a little bit of classical Indian music where they have these ragas which are certain pitches are associated with gestures where a vocalist would only approach this note from above, this note from below by 1/3, and it's a much more intricate way of listening, which these even blocks simply they would fail to notate the gestures in question. But actually, on that subject, I had a question for the composers, whether because the word quarter tone to a lot of people makes their hair stand up. Are you worried about performers chasing the notation and not getting at the soul garden, not getting at the spirit of the gesture.
I think there's something about, we were talking about this yesterday, transformation in music, and and sometimes something very deep happens when there's a transformation. And I mean, I'm a big believer as a composer that transformation is a very important part of composing, especially when using quote unquote folk materials, or in this sense, the transformation from the voice to the instruments. And originally, Paul had asked, he said, Derek, would you write a piece for viola, string quartet, and piano? And I said, sure, that sounds like a great combination. And the more I started thinking about the language of this piece, which comes out of this singing, gospel music is not a diatonic music. I mean, it is. In fact, it's very centered on the pentatonic scale, but it's not, it goes between the notes. And if you don't allow that to come into it, then you're not really getting at, you're not getting at the tonal aspect of what actually happens in gospel music. On the other hand, the problem is, how do you notate that? And how do you not overly notate it so that it looks so complex that it can't be played, but how do you let the players into that world and without constraining them, with a straitjacket? And so this was my battle.
Actually, what I would have suggested is that with every piece of music, there should be a little CD or something with you just singing that tune. I think would be very helpful.
Okay, right. Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of the people did consult the CD. It's great that it's recorded because that helps when players can hear it, and I think the fact that that's around and available is helps people approach learning it. But I also do think that I mean in this sense, the quarter tones, like I said, they're more inflections, and I just searched for, I had a sound in my head and I wanted to realize it. So the paper part of it was getting that sound out of my head and onto the paper into a way that was able to be communicated to others.
If I just might add, from what I've learned about it, this subject kind of, if you turn it around the other way, it's very interesting the tremendous amount of time that Bartók devoted to transcribing with great precision what was happening in a band playing the music of a certain town, and of course my own instinct is that he viewed this as a way of training his ear, understanding how that flavor comes about that's in the music. And actually challenging himself to find a way to put it on the page that is both simple enough to be understood, but actually conveys the complexity of what's being heard. And I think, of course, most people that look at those transcriptions are fairly stunned at the beautiful way that he managed to capture these very small details and inflections of what was happening.
Can I add something? It was one of the texts of Bartók, one of the essays of Bartók actually was kind of a revelation for me. I was reading a lot of his essays, and there's two essays of Bartók that speak concretely about the language and how, for a composer, he has to master the language. Also, in relation to folk music, the importance of the language, understanding the language of the people that you're transcribing, and that includes also the musical language. And I think my challenge is how, if I'm dealing with very particular elements of certain, for instance, in tonight's program, I have little cells that are from Central Portugal, or they're derived from certain kind of songs. How can I present, or how can people that don't have no relation with my country and never heard the original songs, how can they understand it, not knowing Portuguese, not knowing the songs, not knowing the cultural. For instance, I mentioned the first movement. I take this gesture, which comes from a trelhoada, which is a song work of the peasants, and it's not that the Portuguese will sit there, oh, this is a trelhoada. No, because it's so different, but it's just the gesture of the working and this accentuation ever two, and a very rough thing. So I think my challenge is not really the notation and quartet tone, but is a challenge in how the ensemble perceives a music that is so foreign to them, or there's in this way so precise for another country. And well, I gather what I realized is that when you work, for instance, with Borromeo, it was my first experiment working for this setting of a clarinet quintet. And the first reading that we had, they just played the first movement, and then they stop and say, "What do you think?" And I remember just I didn't know what to say, because I felt that they completely got the energy and the spirit of it right from the first movement. And I think that in that way, when you work with somebody like them, that they are in such a level that completely get the spirit the first time, I think it was just for me incredible experience.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have them with us for this for tonight. All these wonderful artists. I mean, this is I'm like a kid in a candy store with these great artists. I mean, it's terrific. And I look to Fred as a great mentor in programming, who programmed the Great Day in New York series, which was so inspirational about 12 years ago or 10 years ago at the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center. And one thing that Fred said to me was, yeah, you should have short pieces, long pieces, change it up, make sure that, there's variety in all kinds of ways, all kinds of styles. So that's what we're doing tonight. And I like how we came back full circle to talk about Bartók, who certainly casts a great shadow over this program. And I'm going to give the artists half an hour to get their reeds in proper order and their bows rosined up. So thank you very much, and feel free to mill around and talk about us.